Stay exactly where you are. Did you just lean over Mr. Harlow's meal tray without authorization? Flight attendant Claire Whitmore's voice cuts sharply through the narrow business class aisle, her gloved hand already hovering over a half-spilled lobster entree, as if the evidence itself confirms her judgment. In seat 2B, Aaliyah Johnson, a 26-year-old black flight attendant trainee on a probationary observation shift, freezes mid-motion with a service napkin still folded in her hand. She had only leaned forward seconds earlier to adjust a seat pocket that had been sticking out awkwardly into the aisle. A small correction she thought no one would even notice. Yet now the entire row has turned toward her as if a silent signal just called for attention. The cabin does not erupt. It contracts, sound dropping out in uneven layers as conversations die mid-sentence, and overhead bin doors pause halfway closed. Mr. Harlow, a middle-aged executive in a tailored navy suit, slowly looks down at the spilled sauce on his sleeve, then back at Aaliyah with a confused tightening of his brow, as though trying to map cause and effect in real time. Claire does not wait for clarity. She steps slightly to the side, positioning herself between Aaliyah and the rest of the aisle like a gatekeeper controlling visibility itself, her posture precise, practiced, certain. You were the only one leaning into this section during service delivery. She continues, not raising her voice, but sharpening it in a way that forces everyone to listen harder. Aaliyah's fingers pause for half a second longer than intended, her eyes flicking briefly toward the surrounding passengers, registering the sudden attention. The way people who were strangers moments ago are now silently forming interpretations without speaking a word. A flight attendant further back slows her cart, watching without intervening, while a passenger near the window subtly shifts their phone downward, no longer pretending to scroll. The accusation itself is not framed as hostility, but as procedure, which makes it heavier, more difficult to challenge in the moment because it feels already documented even before being spoken. Aloud, Aaliyah finally exhales softly through her nose, a controlled pause rather than hesitation, then straightens her posture, keeping her voice low and steady. I did not touch his tray. I was adjusting the seat pocket that was hanging into the aisle. Her tone carries no confrontation, only clarification, but the timing lands into a space already shaped by assumption rather than inquiry. Claire does not respond immediately, her eyes moving once across Aaliyah's uniform badge, then toward the spilled plate again, as if searching for alignment between observation and expectation. The silence that follows is not empty. It is occupied, filled with the weight of passengers waiting to see which version of reality will be accepted. Mr. Harlow shifts slightly in his seat, uncomfortable but silent, while a nearby passenger lets out a faint breath that sounds almost like a decision being made without words. Aaliyah notices everything without reacting outwardly, her hands remaining still at her sides, her expression composed but tightened at the edges, like someone aware that explanation alone may not be enough in a space where perception is already moving faster than truth. Claire finally tilts her head a fraction, maintaining control of the moment without escalation. We will review exactly what happened before service continues in this section. The aisle remains frozen for another beat, as if the aircraft itself is waiting for permission to resume normal motion. If this moment caught your attention, subscribe for more cinematic stories like this and turn on notifications so you do not miss what happens next, and tell us where you are watching from right now. What time is it where you are as this story unfolds? The aisle does not move back in a normal rhythm after Claire Whitmore's statement. It only pretends to. Service carts begin rolling again, but each will sound slightly louder than it should, as if the cabin is overcompensating for silence that refuses to leave. Aaliyah Johnson remains in seat 2B with her hands resting near her lap, her service napkin now neatly folded again, not because anything required it, but because stillness feels safer than movement. In a space where movement is being quietly observed, Claire has already turned away, stepping forward down the aisle with precise pacing, her attention fully redirected to the service flow ahead, as if the previous moment has been filed away and closed without emotional residue. Yet behind her, the effect lingers in fragments. A passenger in 2C keeps glancing sideways at Aaliyah, not openly, but in short delayed checks that feel like unfinished curiosity. Across the aisle, Mr. Harlow adjusts his cuff once, then twice, as though the small stain on his sleeve has become heavier in memory than in fabric. No one speaks directly about what happened, but language is no longer needed for the acknowledgement that something shifted. Aaliyah subtly repositions her shoulders, a small correction in posture that blends into professionalism but carries the quiet effort of recalibration under observation. Her eyes drop to the seat pocket she had adjusted earlier, now perfectly aligned, and she briefly presses her fingers against the edge of the material, confirming its placement as if anchoring herself in a task that cannot be misinterpreted. The cabin continues its service cycle, yet interactions have slowed by fractions that are noticeable only in comparison to what came before. Drink orders take an extra second to be repeated, smiles from attendants hold slightly longer before fading, and even the announcement system overhead feels more distant, as if filtered through thicker air. Claire does not look back, does not recheck the aisle, and does not alter her pace, maintaining a composed authority that signals closure from her perspective, regardless of whether closure has actually occurred for anyone else. Aaliyah reaches for a small item in her seat pocket, a pen and notepad used for shift notes, and hesitates for a moment longer than necessary before writing, her hand steadying only after the first line is completed. The act is simple, procedural, yet it becomes a focal point for at least one passenger who watches before quickly pretending not to. Somewhere 2 rows ahead, a faint murmur begins and stops mid-sentence, as if the speaker decides the topic is no longer appropriate for public air. The aircraft continues forward through mild turbulence, a gentle vibration passing through the floor that causes glassware to tremble slightly, and Aaliyah's fingers pause again on the page before resuming. She does not look up, but her awareness shifts subtly, tracking movement without engaging it, maintaining distance while still existing within it. The space around her remains unchanged physically, yet socially it feels redistributed, as if invisible lines have been redrawn without announcement. No one confronts her, no one defends her, and no one resolves anything, because nothing has escalated enough to demand resolution, but everything has shifted enough to prevent return to neutrality. Claire's voice eventually returns over the intercom, calm and procedural, directing the next phase of service with unchanged authority, reinforcing continuity rather than addressing rupture. Aaliyah listens without reaction, her pen continuing its small, controlled movements, each stroke steadying her presence within a cabin that has not forgiven or condemned her, but is still deciding how to see her in the space between both. The service rhythm has not returned to normal so much as it has adapted to an invisible imbalance, where every movement in the aisle now feels slightly more deliberate than before, as if the cabin is unconsciously recalibrating itself around what just happened. Aaliyah Johnson remains seated in 2B, her posture unchanged, but her awareness no longer rests only on her task. It extends outward in quiet intervals, tracking motion she does not openly acknowledge. Claire Whitmore moves through the forward section with steady confidence, addressing passengers with the same measured professionalism as before, her voice unchanged, her pacing uninterrupted, and her attention fully committed to service flow, as if the earlier disruption existed in a separate layer of time that does not require revisiting. A tray is lifted, replaced, adjusted, and handed forward with practiced precision, and each interaction she conducts reinforces her control over the environment without any visible friction or hesitation. Behind her, the cabin maintains its observation without announcement. A man across the aisle shifts his tablet angle slightly, not actively watching but not fully disengaged either, and a woman near the window smooths her sleeve twice before settling her hands in her lap again, a subtle repetition that suggests attention has not fully dissolved. Aaliyah lowers her gaze briefly to the edge of her seatbelt latch, then stills, her fingers resting lightly on her notepad without writing, as though the act of starting something might draw more attention than remaining in pause. A passing attendant reaches 2A to confirm Mr. Harlow's replacement meal, and the exchange is smooth, but the brief moment before response feels extended, like the room is processing instructions with slight delay. Mr. Harlow himself avoids looking directly toward Aaliyah now, focusing instead on the tray being adjusted in front of him, yet his posture remains subtly rigid, as if the earlier confusion has not fully resolved into comfort. Claire pauses only once to correct the angle of a tray table, her hand precise and unbothered, her demeanor unchanged, maintaining the same operational calm that suggests full confidence in the structure she is managing. Aaliyah, meanwhile, begins a small, almost imperceptible adjustment in her breathing rhythm, not visible as emotion but noticeable in the way her shoulders settle more deliberately into alignment, a controlled effort to remain consistent under sustained awareness. A pen is lifted again, then set down without writing, a hesitation so small it reads more like timing than indecision, and she shifts the notepad slightly closer to her body rather than leaving it exposed on the armrest. The cabin lighting remains constant, but its effect feels different now, less neutral and more revealing, as if illumination itself contributes to visibility rather than comfort. Conversations further down the aisle remain subdued, none returning fully to earlier ease, and even laughter from the rear section arrives faintly delayed, never fully bridging the distance forward. Claire completes another service interaction and continues forward without interruption, her presence reinforcing continuity and authority in motion, while Aaliyah remains in place, adjusting only what is necessary to maintain composure within a space that has not returned her to anonymity. The aircraft continues its steady course, and though no new event occurs, the absence of change itself becomes its own form of pressure, holding the moment in a prolonged state of quiet observation that has not yet released its focus. Aaliyah Johnson does not wait for the next instruction to arrive from Claire Whitmore before completing the service handoff in 2B, a small deviation that begins as hesitation and resolves into decision within a single controlled breath. As she reaches for Mr. Harlow's replacement tray that had been placed at the edge of the service cart and positions it onto his table without signaling for confirmation from the supervising attendant. The movement is precise, measured, and technically correct, but it bypasses the expected sequence where Claire would normally acknowledge or finalize placement, and that subtle break in rhythm is immediately felt in the surrounding space. Mr. Harlow looks up mid-adjustment of his sleeve, his attention shifting to the tray arriving without verbal transition, and for a brief moment his expression tightens in mild uncertainty, as though recalibrating whether protocol has changed or he has missed a cue. Claire Whitmore, several steps ahead in the aisle, pauses mid-extension of her arm as she prepares to receive another service item from a passing attendant, her hand remaining suspended for a fraction longer than natural motion requires before she completes the action and slowly turns her head just enough to register the deviation behind her. She does not speak immediately, but her silence carries structure, not confusion, and the next interaction she conducts is deliberately slower, each movement slightly more defined, as if reinforcing that flow is still under her control even if one element has moved outside expected timing. Aaliyah, still facing forward, holds her posture for a half-second after completing the tray placement, then adjusts the position of a napkin that was already correctly aligned, not out of necessity, but as a stabilizing gesture that allows her to re-enter procedural rhythm without signaling hesitation. Her eyes flick once toward the aisle ahead, then return to her workspace with controlled neutrality, yet her fingers tighten briefly around the edge of the service cart before releasing, a micro-adjustment that signals awareness of consequence without external expression. A passenger seated diagonally across from Mr. Harlow shifts slightly, now observing the interaction with clearer focus, and another further back leans forward just enough to reduce the distance of attention without making it obvious. The cabin does not escalate, but it reorganizes itself around the deviation, as if each observer is quietly updating an internal model of how strict the structure truly is. Claire finally speaks, her voice calm and level but carrying a sharpened edge of procedural authority. Wait for confirmation before final placement in that section. The sentence is not loud, but it is directed precisely into the space where Aaliyah stands, ensuring it is heard not only by her, but by anyone within range who has been tracking the exchange. Aaliyah does not respond verbally, but she pauses a fraction longer than necessary before resuming her next task, a controlled reset of timing that aligns her back into expected sequence without acknowledgement or resistance. Her shoulders remain steady, but her wrist adjusts the angle of the service cart handle slightly more firmly than before, as though re-establishing physical grounding in the workflow. Claire resumes forward movement immediately after the instruction, not revisiting the moment, her posture unchanged and her authority intact in motion rather than dialogue. The surrounding passengers settle back into partial disengagement, yet the earlier observation has not fully dissolved. It lingers in shorter glances and delayed attention returns, as if the cabin is now aware that procedural boundaries are not entirely uniform. Aaliyah continues servicing the row, each action now slightly more deliberate in timing rather than execution, maintaining professionalism while subtly recalibrating how she moves under continued awareness. No one intervenes, no further correction is issued, and the aircraft proceeds in steady flight. But the structure of attention within the cabin has shifted enough that even routine movements now carry a faint sense of evaluation that did not exist moments before. The next service action does not come with a request or confirmation. It comes with a silence that feels heavier than the aisle itself, as Aaliyah Johnson stands at 2B preparing the final adjustment for Mr. Harlow's table setup, where the remaining beverage order must be placed exactly according to cabin protocol, without deviation. Her hand hovers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary above the glass, not from uncertainty in execution, but from awareness that every movement now exists under observation that has not softened since the earlier deviation. Behind her, Claire Whitmore is no longer several steps ahead. She has paused mid-aisle, holding a service tablet in one hand while maintaining a posture that suggests she is not observing directly. Yet her stillness directs attention more effectively than movement ever could. A short instruction comes without preface. Complete the service sequence before moving forward in that section. And the phrasing is neutral, but its placement leaves no space for interpretation other than control being reaffirmed in real time. Aaliyah responds only through motion, not speech, placing the glass onto the tray surface with careful alignment. Yet the absence of verbal acknowledgement becomes its own visible element in the interaction, noticed by at least two passengers who subtly adjust their gaze toward the exchange. Mr. Harlow shifts again in his seat, this time slower, his hand resting near the edge of the tray without touching it, as though uncertain whether his participation is required in the moment unfolding in front of him. Claire remains still for another second longer than natural pacing would require, then resumes forward motion. But instead of passing, she angles slightly toward the aisle line where Aaliyah is working, reinforcing spatial dominance through positioning rather than confrontation. The surrounding cabin tightens its attention again, not through sound, but through reduction of unrelated motion. A magazine stops turning a page, a headphone is adjusted and then left untouched, a drink is set down without the usual follow-up movement. Aaliyah begins the next step in the service sequence. But there is a brief interruption in her rhythm when she reaches for the second tray item, her fingers pausing just before contact, as if recalculating timing under observation, then completing the action with slightly increased precision that removes any unnecessary motion. Claire's voice returns immediately after, lower but sharper in structure. Proceed exactly in sequence from this point forward without deviation. And this time the instruction carries the implicit weight of finality rather than correction. Aaliyah's response is not spoken. Instead, she adjusts her stance by a few inches, aligning her body more squarely with the service card, a controlled correction that signals compliance without submission being explicitly performed. The cabin air feels denser in perception rather than reality. As passengers continue watching longer than socially necessary, their attention no longer passive, but engaged in silent evaluation of outcome rather than incident. A flight attendant farther down the aisle slows momentarily before continuing forward, choosing not to enter the immediate space, as if the section itself has become temporarily defined by procedural tension. Claire finally resumes full forward movement, but she leaves behind a lingering structure of expectation that keeps the focus anchored where Aaliyah stands. Aaliyah completes the remaining placement of items in strict sequence, each motion now executed with heightened exactness that minimizes opportunity for further interpretation, her fingers briefly tightening around the edge of the tray only after completion, a controlled reset that does not break professionalism but reveals sustained pressure under continued observation. No resolution is offered, no clarification is given, and no shift in authority occurs. Yet the cabin remains locked in a state where every small action continues to be weighed against the earlier deviation that has not yet been. allowed to fully disappear from attention. The cabin does not return to normal movement after the previous sequence. Instead, it settles into a prolonged stillness where motion continues but feels muted, as if every action is occurring under a shared awareness that is not yet dissolved. Aaliyah Johnson remains at 2B with her hands resting lightly on the edge of the service card, her posture unchanged from the last completed task, but her movements now slower by subtle increments that are only noticeable in comparison to earlier rhythm. She reaches for a folded napkin, pauses mid-extension for a fraction longer than necessary, then completes the placement with careful alignment that appears almost mechanical in precision, yet is clearly intentional in its restraint. Claire Whitmore is no longer directly adjacent, but remains within visual reach down the aisle, her stance angled slightly toward forward service operations. Yet her head turns once in a measured motion that lingers longer than previous glances, observing without interruption, as if confirming continuity rather than initiating correction. No instruction follows immediately, and that absence becomes its own structure, filling the space between them with a quiet that is not empty, but occupied by expectation. Aaliyah adjusts her grip on the card handle, loosening then tightening once in a controlled cycle, a small physical reset that stabilizes her position without drawing attention. The passengers closest to 2B no longer shift or reposition as frequently. Instead, they settle into longer intervals of still observation, as if uncertain whether normal behavior has fully resumed or is still in transition. A glass is lifted and set down further ahead in the aisle, and the sound is slightly delayed in perception, not due to volume, but due to attention being directed elsewhere within the cabin. Claire resumes movement, but at a reduced pace, each step evenly spaced, maintaining authority through consistency rather than urgency, and she passes without acknowledging the earlier sequence directly, though her attention briefly settles once more in Aaliyah's direction before continuing forward. Aaliyah begins the next task in the service flow, but midway through reaching for a supply compartment, her hand slows for a brief instant, then continues with adjusted precision, as if recalibrating internal timing under sustained observation. Her gaze drops momentarily toward the edge of the cart, then lifts back to the immediate task area without scanning the cabin, a controlled narrowing of focus that reduces external awareness while preserving outward composure. No passenger speaks, yet a faint collective stillness persists, not imposed but maintained, as though the cabin has not yet decided whether to fully release attention. Claire stops briefly near the forward galley entrance, not for instruction or correction, but for a pause that lasts just long enough to be noticeable, then continues without turning back. Aaliyah completes another service step with steady, deliberate motion, her shoulders remaining level, but her cadence slightly more measured than before, holding stability within a space that has not fully returned to neutrality. The aircraft continues its steady flight path, and although no new event occurs, the absence of resolution keeps the atmosphere suspended in a quiet tension that has not yet begun to fade. The shift begins without announcement, not as a sound or interruption, but as a sequence correction visible only because of what it contradicts. When a junior flight attendant from the forward galley steps into the aisle, holding a compact tablet, and pauses directly beside Claire Whitmore, instead of proceeding past her as protocol would normally require. The attendant's thumb taps once, then again, and the screen brightness reflects faintly off Claire's uniform sleeve before the device is angled upward in a way that forces immediate attention rather than optional acknowledgement. Claire stops mid-reach toward a service latch she has opened dozens of times earlier in the flight, her hand remaining suspended just above the compartment edge, as if the motion itself has been paused by an external system rather than choice. The junior attendant speaks only 2 words, quiet but structured, service log, and turns the tablet toward Claire and the surrounding aisle, in a way that unintentionally exposes the feed to nearby passengers. The screen displays a live operational sequence summary tied to the service card assigned to Section 2B, timestamped and automatically recorded from internal cabin monitoring systems, showing a clear entry that contradicts the earlier assumption. Tray placement executed by assigned trainee under approved correction protocol. No passenger interference detected. The sentence remains visible for a fraction longer than necessary as the system refresh delay holds it on screen, and that delay becomes the pivot point where attention in the cabin visibly reorients. Several passengers simultaneously shift their gaze from Aaliyah Johnson to the tablet display, not dramatically, but in synchronized fragments of realization that spread without spoken communication. Mr. Harlow leans slightly forward for the first time since the incident, his eyes tracking the screen instead of the aisle, and his earlier tension loosens into a small but noticeable adjustment of posture that signals reassessment rather than discomfort. Claire's hand lowers slowly from the compartment, not abruptly, but with a controlled reduction in motion that differs from her earlier certainty, and her head turns just enough to read the entry fully, holding on the text longer than a routine check would require. Aaliyah remains in place at 2B, her hands still positioned near the service card, not reacting outwardly to the display, maintaining the same measured posture she has held throughout, which now becomes visually contrasted against the system confirmation behind her. The junior attendant does not elaborate further, but simply holds the tablet steady as additional log entries scroll automatically, confirming equipment stability and sequence compliance for the section. A second line appears beneath the first. No deviation from service protocol recorded in 2B interaction window. That second confirmation causes a visible recalibration in the cabin atmosphere, not through sound, but through synchronized attention shift, as passengers begin to reevaluate the earlier moment in real time. Claire's movement pauses again, this time more clearly, her fingers briefly tightening around the edge of the service latch before releasing it entirely, without completing the prior action. Her eyes remain on the screen for a final beat, then lift toward the aisle where Aaliyah stands. But the look is no longer procedural certainty. It is measured reassessment held within professional restraint. Aaliyah finally adjusts her grip on the card handle, a small stabilizing motion that now reads differently under changed context, no longer as compliance under correction, but as consistency under verification. The surrounding passengers' focus shifts again, this time away from suspicion toward observation of process integrity, with one person subtly lowering their gaze to their own tray, as if recalibrating their understanding of what they just witnessed. The cabin does not become loud, but it changes density, as attention that was once directed at Aaliyah redistributes into a broader evaluation of procedure itself. Claire steps back half a pace from the compartment, resuming control of her posture, but the earlier certainty in her positioning has softened into operational restraint, and she does not immediately issue further instruction. Aaliyah remains still for a brief moment longer than necessary, then resumes her task with the same controlled precision as before, unchanged in execution, but now under a different layer of visibility, as the environment around her continues adjusting to the confirmed record that has already begun to replace assumption. The cabin does not return to its earlier rhythm immediately after the system log confirmation. Instead, it settles into a controlled recalibration where movement resumes, but carries visible hesitation in how authority is expressed and received. Claire Whitmore resumes forward motion down the aisle, but her pace is no longer fully linear. She slows once at the midpoint of her stride, as if reconsidering whether to reassert the previous structure of control, then continues without issuing the type of directive she would have used earlier in the flight. When she reaches the next service junction, her hand lifts toward a compartment handle, then pauses mid-air for a fraction longer than habitual efficiency would allow before she completes the motion and opens it with slightly reduced force, signaling not uncertainty in process, but adjustment in approach. Her eyes pass over Aaliyah Johnson once during this sequence, not with dismissal or correction, but with a brief, measured assessment that lingers longer than any prior glance in the flight. Then she redirects her attention forward without verbal reinforcement of authority. Aaliyah remains at 2B continuing her service responsibilities, but the nature of her motion subtly shifts. She no longer performs actions under the weight of anticipation, but under visible neutrality, completing each task with the same precision while allowing slightly longer spacing between movements, as if the environment itself no longer dictates urgency. A passenger near the aisle lowers their gaze more quickly than before when Claire passes, but this time the motion carries less tension and more observational recalibration, as though the earlier certainty in interpretation has been replaced by uncertainty in judgment. Mr. Harlow adjusts his seat belt once, then stops halfway through a second adjustment, abandoning the movement entirely, and instead focuses on the tray alignment in front of him with a neutral expression that no longer carries earlier implication. Claire pauses again near the service cart station, this time not due to interruption or correction, but due to internal procedural reassessment. Her hand hovers above the tablet interface before she completes a simple status update input, and the delay in execution is noticeable only because of its contrast to her earlier decisiveness. When she resumes, her instructions to the nearby attendant are shorter, more procedural, and less interpretive, focusing on sequence rather than implication. Aaliyah completes a standard placement cycle, then briefly holds the edge of the cart longer than required before releasing it, a stabilizing motion that now reads as routine control rather than defensive adjustment. The surrounding passengers begin to return to their personal activities in fragments, but their engagement is no longer uniform. Some resume reading while others continue intermittent observation, creating a divided attention field rather than unified scrutiny. Claire stops once more at the boundary between aisle segments, not to correct or confront, but to allow a brief pause and flow before proceeding. And when she moves again, it is with a recalibrated steadiness that suggests authority is being maintained through adaptation rather than assertion. Aaliyah continues her work sequence without interruption, maintaining professional consistency, and though her actions remain unchanged in structure, the space around her no longer interprets them through the same lens of presumption. The cabin does not relax fully, nor does it escalate, but it stabilizes into a new equilibrium where control is shared between procedural confirmation and observed behavior, and the earlier imbalance no longer defines the direction of attention, only its memory. Claire Whitmore stops at the final service junction before the forward galley, not with urgency or command, but with a deliberate pause that breaks the expected rhythm of her movement. And for the first time since the beginning of the flight, she turns her body fully toward the aisle section, where Aaliyah Johnson stands at 2B. The cabin does not react with noise, but attention subtly realigns, passengers who had begun to disengage now returning to a quiet observational focus, as if sensing that something procedural rather than corrective is about to conclude. Claire does not speak immediately. Instead, she lowers her hand from the service tablet and holds it still for a brief moment, then taps once to finalize a status entry that visibly updates the service log confirmation system linked to the aisle section. The screen is not shown to the cabin this time, but the action itself is deliberate and visible enough in timing and posture that its meaning is understood without announcement. Aaliyah remains still, maintaining professional stance beside the service cart, her hands resting without tension, not adjusting, not retreating, simply holding position as the environment shifts around her rather than through her. Claire takes a step closer, slower than any of her previous movements in the flight, and instead of continuing past or issuing instruction, she stops directly within conversational distance, then angles slightly so her body no longer blocks or controls the space between Aaliyah and the aisle. This repositioning is subtle but definitive, changing the spatial hierarchy that had defined the earlier tension. A brief silence follows, not heavy now but settling, as passengers register the absence of correction or accusation that would have previously defined this moment. Claire then performs a small but unmistakable procedural adjustment. She reaches to the service cart, takes the final item from Aaliyah's completed sequence, and places it into the forward return tray herself without review, without challenge, and without commentary, a direct acknowledgement of completion that replaces earlier scrutiny. The action is precise, efficient, and final, and when she withdraws her hand, she does not re-engage the earlier control pattern of inspection or validation. Instead, she gives a short, controlled nod toward Aaliyah, not as praise, but as formal closure of responsibility transfer. Aaliyah does not respond verbally. She simply lowers her hands to rest fully at her sides for a moment, then returns them to a neutral service position, maintaining the same composed posture she has held throughout the flight. Around them, passengers gradually disengage from observation, some returning to reading, others adjusting seat positions, and the collective attention that had been concentrated on this section begins to disperse in stages rather than all at once. Mr. Harlow looks away from the aisle entirely now, focusing on his tray and then his window, no longer tracking the interaction. Claire steps back into her original service path, but her movements no longer carry corrective intent. They return to operational flow without emphasis on evaluation. As she passes the next passenger row, she does not pause or recheck the section behind her, signaling that the moment has been formally concluded within procedure rather than lingering interpretation. Aaliyah resumes standard service motion, completing a final card adjustment and securing the compartment latch with steady, unhurried precision. The aisle gradually returns to its normal flight rhythm, with carts rolling, quiet exchanges resuming, and attention dispersing into individual spaces rather than collective focus. The only remaining visible change is spatial. Claire no longer occupies the boundary line between control and observation, and Aaliyah continues her duties without interruption or scrutiny, as the cabin fully returns to its steady course above the clouds. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts and consider subscribing for more cinematic narratives. Thank you for watching.